Lent, in addition to the scripture reading for each week, we are offering a contemporary word, a quote on the week's theme for you to consider. Today's contemporary word is from Rachel Carson. The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe, the less taste we shall have for destruction. And today's ancient word. At Bible study last week, we were very interested in two phrases that brought a lot of discussion. And one is, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. And the other, Christ rebuked the storm. So consider these as you hear the reading from Matthew 8, verses 18 to 27. This is a healing story that comes from Matthew's gospel. Now, when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. A scribe then approached and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of his disciples said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. They were amazed, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?"
When I was a young adult living in my parents' home between educational opportunities, I was awakened one night by a huge electrical storm full of thunder and lightning. Now, I grew up in the San Diego area, and like anywhere here on the California coast, thunderstorms are an uncommon meteorological phenomenon. This storm was massive, and it went on for what seemed like forever. And after watching the electricity light up my bedroom ceiling for a while, I crept out to the living room where the big picture window looked out over the valley, and I sat in the window seat for a long time, marveling at the light show, marveling at the power of this storm, a kind of storm that I rarely got to witness. Part of me was awed and amazed by the marvelous power of the natural world, and part of me was afraid of it. I've never forgotten that night. This memory floated up as I read our scripture reading this past week, and I pondered the storm in Matthew's gospel and the reactions of the disciples and Jesus to that storm. And the more I contemplated this passage, the more I realized how curious it is. It juxtaposes two passages that don't seem to relate to each other, right? In the first part, Jesus is approached by two potential disciples, and Jesus offers two different odd replies to them. One being the familiar phrase, "Let the dead bury their own dead." In the second part, Jesus gets into the boat with the disciples to head across the lake, and the storm happens. It's interesting to note that these two sections do appear in other Gospels. The first part is in Luke, and the second part is in both Luke and Mark, but they're not placed next to each other in Luke's Gospel, and the first section doesn't appear at all in Mark. They don't seem to go together. They're not put together in the other Gospel, and yet they're juxtaposed in Matthew, and it is apparent that the Gospel writer intentionally did that. The first part begins with Jesus giving orders to go over to the other side. In other words, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And then in the second part, they all get into the boat and head for the other side. So these two curious stories are meant to be seen together, despite seeming not to have much to do with each other. The first section is a compact statement about discipleship. In two brief encounters, just 2 sentences each, Jesus speaks volumes about what it means to follow him. In the first encounter, a scribe approaches him and says, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Now, a scribe in Jesus' time was a person who could read and write, which in a society with 90% illiteracy meant that this is a person with some privilege. In the New Testament, the scribes are seen with the elders, the chief priests, the Pharisees. They were essentially part of the elite in Jesus' community. This scribe was probably living the first century equivalent of a comfortable middle-class life. And when he says he will follow Jesus, he basically says, I'm homeless. In other words, if you want to follow me, you have to be willing to give up your life of comfort, privilege, and power, and essentially become homeless like me. And the second encounter is no different. A disciple says to Jesus, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." And Jesus replies, "Let the dead bury their own dead." This would have been a shocking statement to those who heard it. First, filial obligation in the first century, that duty to parents, that's written into the Torah. One of the 10 Commandments is honor your father and mother. So Jesus suggests that being his disciple means moving beyond our families of birth and becoming a new family together, the family of Jesus. And then, as if to prove his point about discipleship, Jesus gets into the boat with his little family of disciples, and they get into trouble. The Sea of Galilee, or Lake Kinneret, as it's known in modern Israel, is shallow. It's about the size of Mono Lake. It's a little smaller than Mono. It's about as shallow as Mono. And because of the valley that it sits in, and the winds that tunnel in from the mountain pass to the west, it's prone to sudden storms. And here's another curious thing about this text. The disciples, many of whom are fishermen, would have been intimately familiar with sailing on Galilee and remaining calm in its storms. And yet this storm is so frightening that they ask Jesus for help. They had left behind what they knew in order to do a new thing. It was hard, even terrifying. They had to rely on faith in the life that Jesus called them to persevere, even through storms. They had to recognize and trust that Jesus was and would always be in the boat with them, giving them his strength. Throughout Lent, we've been focusing on the healing stories in Matthew's gospel, exploring their message of wholeness in our brokenness as we explored healing in our body, our mind, our spirit, and our community. And this week we turn our attention to the cosmos, to our place within the whole of creation, and the way our own health and wholeness is intimately tied to the health and wholeness of our precious planet. In the storm on the Sea of Galilee, We're reminded of the magnificence and the raw power of God's creation. We're reminded that the God who heals through a gentle touch is also a God who rebukes the wind and waves. We have a lot of brokenness in our lives that calls for healing, for renewal and restoration, and perhaps nothing is more immediate and more important than the healing, renewal, and restoration of the planet. The health of the natural environment impacts more than we can even imagine. If we work toward recovery of ourselves and our communities, but fail to work toward the recovery of our environment, we will find ourselves caught up in constant cycles of destruction. Like the disciples in the boat who awake in fear to the storm of their lives, we too must awake in the storm of environmental crisis. The urgency of the storm must call us to awareness and action. As the climate activist Greta Thunberg said to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland 2 years ago, I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act. Most of the time when I think about addressing climate change and what I can possibly do to make a difference, I am like those disciples in the storm. I feel the waves threatening to swamp the boat. I am overcome by fear. And like the scribe, I'm more likely to retreat into the comfort of my privilege than to step out bravely into the storm, to shed that privilege and be willing to do hard things. If I don't act, then nothing will change. But where do we begin? One of the daily devotionals that I receive by email is one from the Reverend Cameron Trimble, who's a UCC pastor. Last week, her devotional recalled the fear she felt while she was sheltering in place during a tornado watch where she lives near Atlanta. She recognized that the increasing number of storms that they had been experiencing in her area were due to climate change, and she felt overwhelmed by the work required to make any change toward healing the planet or toward healing our society from the social climate crisis of racism. Sometimes I don't know where to start that work, Trimble said. It all feels overwhelming, like standing in front of the ruins of a house after the winds have torn through. Where do you start the cleanup? What should be salvaged? What should be scrapped? What should be built anew? She goes on to say, I'm learning in my own life that when we start where we are, picking up piece by piece, doing what we can in our little corner of the world to make it look a bit more just, more generous, kind, and equitable, with enough of us committed to a more beautiful world, our patches will one day meet and become a tapestry of heaven come to earth. The healing of all creation is intertwined and interdependent. We must leave behind what we know in order to do a new thing. It might be hard. It might be terrifying. But it is our calling, and we know Jesus is with us. We can move in new directions. We can steer the ship through the storm. We can face storms because we are a people led by the healer, the calm in the storm, who can offer us faith in the midst of fear. There is no other way to get to the other side. Amen. This week, for our symbolic ritual action, we're going to restore some beauty by adding to the beauty of one of our glass pieces. With your Lenten supplies, you received a piece of craft wire, and you're invited to wrap some of that wire around one of your pieces of beach glass, creating a little pendant or that can be hung in a window or a necklace. a constant reminder of our role as those who must care for or contribute to rather than diminish the beauty of the earth. I'm going to turn on the ritual cam here and ask Jim to spotlight it. Okay, so you should be able to see that. Got my, oops, I just jostled the camera, sorry. Got my little beach glass here. I'm gonna, Jeff's gonna play some music. I am going to show you how I'm gonna wrap my, my sea glass with my wire. You can do that now, or you can do it a little later. And if you don't have beach glass and wire, maybe you have a stone or a shell or some string. You can use any of that. And we invite you to take a photo of this when you're done and share it with us on social media. Hang your piece of adorned glass somewhere that you can see it as a reminder of our work of restoration together.